The gentle hum of gospel music filled Mrs. Eleanor Washington's car as she drove home from New Hope Baptist Church on a warm Sunday afternoon. The familiar streets of her Georgia hometown stretched before her, lined with blooming dogwood trees she'd watched grow for over 40 years. At 72, she still found joy in these weekly drives, remembering how she used to bring her young son along, teaching him to count the trees and spot different birds along the way. Her silver sedan moved steadily through the quiet neighborhood, past the elementary school where she'd taught for 3 decades before retiring. Children still called out Mrs. Washington whenever they saw her at the grocery store or park, and their parents, many of them her former students, would stop to chat, sharing stories about their lives and families. The dashboard clock read 2:45 p.m. when she first noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, remembering what she always told her students: stay composed in every situation. She carefully signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning her car perfectly parallel to the sidewalk, just as she taught her son to do years ago. Mrs. Washington's small hands, adorned with her mother's wedding ring, gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2. She could see 2 officers approaching in her side mirror, and something about their stance made her stomach tighten. In all her years of driving, she'd been stopped maybe twice, once for a burnt-out taillight and once during a routine license check. Both times, the officers had been courteous, even calling her ma'am and asking about her students. But these officers moved differently. Their hands rested on their holsters, and their faces wore hard expressions that seemed out of place on such a peaceful Sunday afternoon. The summer heat rippled off the pavement behind them, distorting their figures like a mirage, making the moment feel somehow unreal. She lowered her window slowly, making sure her movements were deliberate and calm. The scent of her church flowers, still fresh on the passenger seat, mixed with the warm Georgia air. On her neck, she wore the emergency alert pendant her son had insisted she carry, just in case, Mama, he'd said, showing her how to press it if she ever needed help. At the time, she'd thought he was being overprotective, but now, watching the officers approach, she felt grateful for her son's foresight. License and registration, the first officer demanded, without any greeting. His voice carried none of the Southern courtesy she'd grown up with and taught her students to value. The second officer circled her car, his flashlight beam cutting through her windows despite the bright afternoon sun. "Of course, officer," Mrs. Washington replied, her teacher's voice steady and clear. As she reached for her purse, moving with deliberate slowness, she noticed how the first officer's hand tightened on his holster. The gesture sent a chill through her, despite the warm day. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed over her license, the same picture she'd been meaning to update, showing her with slightly darker hair from 3 years ago. The registration was in her glove box, neatly filed in a folder along with her insurance and the maintenance records she kept meticulously, just as her late husband had taught her. "Step out of the vehicle," the second officer suddenly ordered, his flashlight beam now directly in her face, making her wince. "May I ask why, officer?" Her voice remained steady, though her heart raced. She thought of all the times she'd told her students to stay calm in difficult situations, to always respond with dignity. "I was just driving home from church." "Ma'am, when an officer gives you an order, you comply," the first officer said, his tone sharp. "Step out of the vehicle now." As Mrs. Washington carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, her fingers brushed against the emergency pendant. Her son's words echoed in her mind. "Mama, promise me you'll use it if you ever feel unsafe. I don't care what time it is or where you are." Looking at the officers' faces, seeing no trace of the community spirit she'd helped build in this town for over 4 decades, Mrs. Washington made her decision. As she moved to open her car door, her fingers pressed firmly on the pendant, sending out a silent call for help. She didn't know it yet, but that simple press of a button would set in motion events that would change not just her afternoon, but her entire community. As she carefully placed her feet on the sun-warmed pavement, standing tall despite her years, Mrs. Washington held on to one thought: her son was coming. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The Georgia sun beat down on the scene, casting long shadows across the street where she'd taught generations of children to look out for one another. Now, standing beside her car while the officers began their unnecessary search, she silently prayed for her son to arrive quickly. But even in her fear, Mrs. Washington maintained the dignity that had carried her through decades of teaching, her spine straight, her head held high, and her faith unshaken. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Mrs. Washington's silver sedan as she stood on the sidewalk, her church shoes pressing against the warm concrete. The two officers had already started their search of her car, their movements aggressive and purposeful. Her heart ached as she watched them carelessly toss aside the church programs she'd helped organize that morning, the papers floating in the gentle Georgia breeze like scattered leaves. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. 40 years of teaching had taught her how to maintain composure in difficult situations. The younger officer ignored her question, instead pulling out the small photo album she kept in her glove compartment, the one filled with pictures of her former students and their achievements. "Ma'am, where did you get this vehicle?" the older officer demanded, flipping through her registration papers with obvious skepticism. The question stung more than she wanted to admit. That car had been a retirement gift from her son, bought with his first bonus as a military officer. She'd driven it proudly for 3 years, keeping it immaculately clean, just as her late husband had taught her to do with every possession. "It's my car, officer." "The registration is in your hand," she replied, gesturing toward the papers he held. Her emergency pendant felt warm against her skin, and she silently prayed her son would arrive soon. The younger officer had moved to the trunk now, roughly pulling out her church choir robe and tossing it onto the ground. "Hey, look what we have here," he called out, holding up her grandson's baseball bat that she'd forgotten to return after last weekend's family gathering. The way he gripped it made her stomach turn, as if this simple piece of sporting equipment was somehow suspicious. A small crowd had begun to gather on their porches, neighbors who'd known Mrs. Washington for decades. She could see Mrs. Chen from across the street, phone in hand, clearly recording the scene. 2 houses down, Mr. Rodriguez, whose daughter had been in her last class before retirement, stood at his fence with a concerned expression. "You need to explain why you're in this neighborhood," the older officer pressed, his tone becoming more aggressive. The absurdity of the demand almost made her laugh. Almost. This was her neighborhood. These were her streets. This was her home of 4 decades. "I live 3 blocks from here," she explained, pointing toward her street. "I've been living there since before you were born, young man." The slight edge in her voice, the same one she used to quiet rowdy classrooms, slipped out before she could stop it. The officer stepped closer, his badge catching the sunlight. "Are you getting an attitude with me, ma'am?" His hand rested on his belt, and Mrs. Washington felt her throat tighten. Behind him, his partner continued ransacking her car, now pulling out the small cooler where she kept water bottles for her Sunday school kids. She thought about all the lessons she'd taught about standing up to injustice, about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. How many times had she told her students about her own mother's courage during the civil rights movement? Now, standing on this familiar street corner, she felt her mother's strength flowing through her. "No attitude, officer. Just stating facts," she replied calmly, though her heart raced. "I've taught at Franklin Elementary for 30 years. Many of your colleagues' children were in my classroom." She kept her hands visible, remembering her son's careful instructions about interactions with law enforcement. The younger officer emerged from her car, holding her purse like it contained evidence of some terrible crime. "There's a lot of cash in here," he announced, pulling out the envelope containing the church collection she was supposed to deposit at the bank tomorrow. "That's church money," she explained, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm the treasurer at New Hope Baptist. Pastor Williams can verify." "Sure it is," the older officer cut her off, his tone dripping with disbelief. He turned to his partner. "We should run a check on this vehicle. Something's not adding up here." Mrs. Washington watched as they began to pull more items from her car. Her grocery list, her Sunday school lesson plans, the birthday card she'd bought for her grandson. Each item was treated like contraband, examined with unwarranted suspicion, and tossed aside with casual disregard. The sun beat down mercilessly as the minutes stretched on. Her legs were starting to ache from standing, but she didn't dare ask to sit down. Instead, she silently counted the time, knowing that her son's base was only 15 minutes away. The emergency pendant had been pressed nearly 10 minutes ago now. More neighbors had gathered, their presence both a comfort and a concern. She could hear whispered conversations, see phones recording the scene, feel the collective tension in the air. These were people who'd watched her son grow up, who'd sent their children to her classroom, who'd sat beside her in church pews. The older officer was running her license through their system now, while his partner continued the increasingly aggressive search of her vehicle. They'd pulled out nearly everything, creating a sad display of her personal belongings on the hot sidewalk, her life scattered around her feet like pieces of a broken puzzle. Just as the younger officer reached for her Bible, still sitting in the passenger seat where she'd left it after church, a new sound cut through the humid Georgia air. The distinctive rumble of a powerful engine approaching fast. Mrs. Washington felt her shoulders relax slightly, recognizing the sound of her son's car. She didn't turn to look, but she could tell from the officer's sudden change in posture that something about the approaching vehicle had caught their attention. The moment of change was coming, and despite everything, Mrs. Washington felt a small smile touch her lips. Her son was about to remind these officers about the true meaning of authority and respect. Mrs. Washington watched as her Bible slid from the passenger seat onto the ground, its worn pages splaying open in the Georgia dust. The sight sparked something deep within her, memories of standing before countless classrooms, teaching children about respect, dignity, and standing tall in difficult moments. She'd spent decades building a life of quiet strength in this community, and now she was watching it being dismantled piece by piece on a hot Sunday afternoon. "Look at this," the younger officer said, picking up her phone from where it had fallen. "Pretty fancy phone for someone in this neighborhood." His words carried a weight that had nothing to do with the device itself, and everything to do with assumptions she fought against her entire life. She straightened her back, smoothing down her church dress with hands that refused to tremble. "My son gave me that phone for Christmas," she explained, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used to quiet rowdy classrooms for 30 years. "He wanted to make sure I could reach him easily." The older officer snorted, continuing to rifle through her purse. "And what does your son do that he can afford phones like this?" The question dripped with skepticism, but Mrs. Washington didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she thought about the lesson she'd taught just that morning at Sunday school, about turning the other cheek while maintaining your dignity. Around her, the neighborhood had become an audience to her humiliation. Mrs. Chen was still recording from her porch, her husband now beside her with their grandson, one of Mrs. Washington's former students who'd just started college. The Rodriguez family had moved closer, standing at the edge of their yard with concerned faces. Even old Mr. Thompson, who rarely left his house anymore, was watching from his window. The younger officer had moved to the back seat, pulling out her grocery bags from earlier that morning. "What's in these?" he demanded, roughly handling the paper bags. "Just groceries for the church food drive," she replied, watching as he appended the bags, sending canned goods rolling across the sidewalk. A can of green beans came to rest against her shoe, and she fought the urge to pick it up. She taught her students about the importance of helping others, about how a small act of kindness could change someone's day. Now those lessons seemed to mock her as she watched her contributions to the food drive scattered across the ground. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Mrs. Washington refused to show any sign of discomfort. She thought about her mother, who'd faced far worse with unwavering dignity. She thought about her late husband, who'd always told her that true strength wasn't about showing anger, but about maintaining composure when others lost theirs. "You still haven't explained how you afforded this car," the older officer pressed, his tone growing more aggressive. "These types of vehicles don't come cheap." Mrs. Washington felt a familiar spark of indignation, the same one she felt decades ago when people questioned her ability to teach their children. But she'd learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, rarely led to positive change. "As I mentioned before, officer, the car was a gift from my son. All the paperwork is legal and proper, as you can see from the registration." Her voice remained steady, though her heart raced beneath her Sunday best dress. The younger officer emerged from the backseat, holding up her photo album again. "Got a lot of pictures in here. Looks like surveillance to me." The absurdity of his statement would have been funny if it weren't so frightening. Those photos were her treasures, snapshots of former students at graduation, children she taught now grown with families of their own. "Those are my students," she explained, her teacher's voice automatically taking on the patient tone she'd used to explain complex topics to young minds. "I taught at Franklin Elementary for 30 years. Many of them still live in this community." As if to prove her point, a voice called out from across the street, "Mrs. Washington? Do you need help?" It was young Tom Chen, her former student who was now studying law at the State University. She could see the worry on his face, the same expression she'd seen when he struggled with long division in 4th grade. "Stay back," the older officer barked, his hand moving to his belt. The gesture sent a ripple of tension through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Washington felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice clear and calm. "It's all right, Tom," she called back, managing a small smile. "Everything will be fine." She'd said those words countless times in her classroom, when a student was struggling with a math problem, when someone was being bullied, when a child was having a bad day. Now she said them again, as much to reassure herself as others. The officers continued their search, but Mrs. Washington's attention had shifted to the growing crowd of neighbors. She saw in their faces the community she'd helped build over 4 decades, faces of former students, parents she'd worked with, families she'd watched grow. They were witnessing her humiliation, but they were also bearing witness to her dignity. She thought about all the times she'd told her students about standing up to injustice, about Rosa Parks, about the children who integrated schools, about ordinary people who maintained their dignity in extraordinary circumstances. Now, standing on that hot sidewalk with her belongings scattered around her, she was living those lessons. The sound of another car approaching caught her attention, but she didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She knew that engine sound, knew that her son was finally arriving. But even as relief flooded through her, Mrs. Washington maintained her composure. She'd stood her ground with dignity thus far, and she would continue to do so. Because that's what she'd always taught her students. Dignity wasn't just about how you acted when things were easy. It was about how you carried yourself through the hardest moments when everything around you seemed designed to strip that dignity away. And as she heard car doors opening behind her, Mrs. Washington stood a little straighter, ready to show everyone watching that her lessons hadn't just been words in a classroom. They were a way of life. The sound of tires on asphalt cut through the humid afternoon air. Mrs. Washington didn't need to turn around to know who it was. A mother always knows her child's approach. The powerful engine of her son's car grew louder, then quieted to a purr as it pulled up behind the police cruiser. The atmosphere shifted instantly, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. What the officers didn't know, as they turned to face the new arrival, was that the man stepping out of the car had just left a military ceremony. He emerged from his vehicle in full dress uniform, medals gleaming in the Georgia sun, stars on his shoulders catching the light. His presence commanded attention without a single word being spoken. The younger officer's hand moved instinctively toward his holster, but froze halfway as he registered the military uniform. The older officer straightened his posture, years of ingrained respect for military authority briefly overriding his previous demeanor. Mrs. Washington felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't a moment for crying. This was a moment for strength. She watched as her son took in the scene before him, his mother's possessions scattered across the sidewalk, her Bible lying in the dust, the church collection money spread out on the hood of the police car like evidence of some crime. His footsteps were measured and deliberate as he approached, each step carrying the weight of his military training and the determination of a son seeing his mother in distress. The crowd of neighbors had fallen completely silent, phones still recording, bearing witness to what was unfolding. Officers, her son's voice carried the calm authority of someone used to commanding rooms full of high-ranking officials. "I'm Colonel Washington of the United States Army, and that's my mother you're detaining." He gestured toward Mrs. Washington with a respectful nod. "Would you mind explaining why her belongings are scattered across the ground?" The older officer's demeanor shifted, his previous aggression giving way to uncertainty. "Sir, we were conducting a routine traffic stop." A routine traffic stop that required emptying the entire contents of her vehicle. The colonel's question was pointed but professional. He pulled out his phone, already recording. "I'd like your badge numbers and your supervisor's contact information, please." Mrs. Washington watched as her son, the little boy she'd raised to always stand up for what was right, handled the situation with a composed efficiency that made her heart swell with pride. He wasn't raising his voice or making threats. He was simply exercising his authority with the same quiet dignity she'd taught him all those years ago. "Ma'am," the younger officer turned to Mrs. Washington, his tone suddenly respectful. "You should have mentioned your son was military." The colonel stepped forward, his shadow falling across the scattered belongings. "My mother shouldn't have to mention my profession to receive basic respect and dignity, officer. She's lived in this community for 40 years. She taught many of your fellow officers' children. That alone should warrant respect." As he spoke, he began carefully picking up his mother's belongings, each item handled with reverence, the Bible dusted off and closed properly, the photo album rescued from where it had been tossed, the church collection money gathered with careful attention to detail. His actions spoke volumes to the watching crowd, showing how these items should have been treated in the first place. The older officer attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, we still need to verify." "You'll verify nothing further," the colonel interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "I'm calling your watch commander now. I suggest you both remain present while I report this incident." He pulled out a small notebook, beginning to document everything he saw. "Mother, are you all right?" His concern was evident, though his professional demeanor never wavered. Mrs. Washington nodded, standing a little straighter. "I'm fine, son. Just tired of standing in this heat." Her voice carried the same strength it had held when she'd faced down school board meetings and parent complaints over her 4 decades of teaching. The colonel turned to the gathering of neighbors. "Did anyone record this incident from the beginning?" Several hands went up, including Mrs. Chen's. "I'll need copies of those recordings, please. Email addresses or phone numbers where I can reach you would be appreciated." The officers shifted uncomfortably as several neighbors stepped forward, offering their contact information and evidence. Young Tom Chen, still in his law school t-shirt, approached with his phone already queued up to the beginning of the incident. "Mrs. Washington was my 4th grade teacher," Tom said to the colonel, though his eyes were fixed on the officers. "She taught us about justice and standing up for what's right." "I've got the whole thing recorded, sir." The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the scene. Mrs. Washington watched as her son efficiently gathered statements from witnesses, his military training evident in his thorough documentation. The neighbors who had gathered were no longer just spectators, they had become participants in ensuring justice would be served. In the distance, another police vehicle approached, this one marked as a supervisor's car. The 2 officers who had initiated the stop stood awkwardly by their patrol car, their earlier bravado replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they would have to explain their actions to their superior officer. Mrs. Washington felt a gentle touch on her arm, her son pausing in his documentation to guide her to the shade of a nearby tree. As she sat down on the garden wall beneath it, she saw the same little boy, who used to hide behind her skirts when things scared him, now standing tall in his military uniform, protecting her just as she had once protected him. The scene around them had transformed from one of humiliation to one of community solidarity. Neighbors were helping gather scattered canned goods, carefully reorganizing the church collection money, and sharing their recordings of the incident. What the officers had meant as an exercise in intimidation had become a demonstration of community strength and family bonds. The supervisor's car pulled up to the scene, its lights off but presence commanding. The afternoon had shifted into early evening, casting long shadows across Mrs. Washington's scattered belongings. The colonel stood tall next to his mother, his military bearing a stark contrast to the now nervous demeanor of the 2 officers who had initiated the stop. The police supervisor, a middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her hair, stepped out of her vehicle and surveyed the scene. Her eyes moved from the scattered belongings to the gathered neighbors, then to Mrs. Washington sitting dignified under the tree, and finally to the colonel in his dress uniform. Her expression tightened as she pieced together what she was seeing. "Lieutenant," the colonel addressed her, noting her rank, "I'm Colonel Washington, United States Army. I've been documenting an incident involving my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Washington, a longtime resident and retired teacher from Franklin Elementary." His voice carried the weight of authority without aggression, a skill Mrs. Washington had watched him develop over years of military service. The lieutenant's gaze shifted to the two officers, who seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. "I'd like to hear exactly what happened here," she said, pulling out her own notebook. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The older officer stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. "Ma'am, we were conducting a routine traffic stop." "A routine traffic stop that required emptying the contents of my mother's vehicle onto the sidewalk?" The colonel interrupted, gesturing to the scene around them. "A routine stop that involved questioning how she could afford her car and phone. A stop where church collection money was treated as suspicious." Mrs. Washington watched as the younger officer shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The neighbors had formed a loose circle around the scene, their phones still recording. Young Tom Chen stepped forward, his law school training evident in his composed demeanor. "Lieutenant," Tom said, holding up his phone, "I have video footage from the beginning of the incident." They didn't give Mrs. Washington any reason for the stop, and they began searching her car without consent. The lieutenant's expression darkened as she watched the video Tom showed her. Mrs. Washington could see her son cataloging every reaction, every detail, his military training evident in his methodical approach. The colonel had learned well from both his mother's teachings about justice and his years of military service. "My mother pressed her emergency alert button," the colonel continued, "which is why I arrived. When I got here, I found her standing in the heat while these officers conducted an unauthorized search of her vehicle. They had scattered her belongings, including her Bible and teaching materials, across the ground." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her own phone displaying more footage. "Mrs. Washington taught my children," she said firmly. "She's been a pillar of this community for decades. The way these officers treated her—" She shook her head, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the air. The lieutenant turned to Mrs. Washington, her tone softening. "Ma'am, I apologize for what you've experienced today. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what happened?" Before Mrs. Washington could respond, the colonel interjected professionally, "My mother has been standing in the heat for over an hour. I suggest we continue this conversation at the station, where she can be comfortable and all statements can be properly recorded." The change in power dynamics was palpable. The two officers who had initiated the stop now stood silently by their patrol car, their earlier show of force replaced by the realization that they would have to answer for their actions. The neighborhood had become a united front, with residents stepping forward one by one to provide their accounts and recordings. Mrs. Washington observed it all from her seat under the tree, her teacher's mind noting how this would become another lesson, not in a classroom this time, but in the community. She watched as her son coordinated with the lieutenant, his military efficiency turning chaos into order. The colonel began organizing the scattered belongings, directing neighbors to help restore her car to its previous state. Each item was handled with care. The church programs smoothed out, the photo album carefully wiped clean, the canned goods collected and reorganized. The respect shown to these simple possessions stood in stark contrast to how they'd been treated earlier. "Mother," the colonel said, turning to Mrs. Washington, "would you like to press formal charges, or would you prefer to handle this through internal affairs?" His question was posed gently, but the steel beneath was clear. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about ensuring such things wouldn't happen to others. Mrs. Washington stood slowly, smoothing her church dress with dignity. The eyes of her community were on her, including many former students who had witnessed the entire incident. Her response would set the tone for what happened next. "Son," she said, her voice carrying the same strength she used in countless classrooms, "we'll do what needs to be done to make sure this becomes a teaching moment." She turned to the lieutenant. "I spent my life educating children about respect, dignity, and justice. It seems some of your officers could use similar lessons." The lieutenant nodded gravely, understanding the weight of Mrs. Washington's words. The two officers who had initiated the stop seemed to shrink further, perhaps finally realizing that their actions would have consequences beyond this afternoon. As the sun continued its descent, casting golden light across the scene, the power shift that had begun with the colonel's arrival was complete. What had started as an attempt to intimidate an elderly black woman had transformed into a moment of community solidarity and institutional accountability. Inside the police station's brightly lit conference room, Mrs. Washington sat with perfect posture, but hands folded neatly on the table before her. The clock on the wall read 7:15 p.m., nearly 5 hours since what should have been a simple drive home from church had turned into something much more significant. Her son, the colonel, sat beside her, his military uniform still crisp despite the long afternoon. He had transformed the scattered documentation from the street into an organized presentation of evidence. Time-stamped videos from neighbors' phones arranged chronologically, written statements from witnesses, and detailed photographs of how her belongings had been thrown about. "Let's review the sequence of events," the police chief said, having been called in specifically for this situation. He was a tall man with graying hair who kept glancing at Mrs. Washington with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You were driving home from church when you were pulled over?" Mrs. Washington nodded, her teacher's voice clear and steady. "Yes, sir. I was about 3 blocks from my home. I've driven that route every Sunday for 40 years. She paused, then added, "The officers never did tell me why they stopped me." The colonel slid forward a tablet showing the street view footage from Mrs. Chen's house. "As you can see, sir, my mother's vehicle was operating perfectly normally. There was no traffic violation to justify the stop." The chief watched the footage, his frown deepening. In the corner of the room, the 2 officers who had conducted the stop shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Their supervisor, Lieutenant Brooks, sat between them, her expression stern. "And then they began searching your vehicle without consent," the chief continued, making notes. "Did they present a warrant or provide any probable cause?" "No, sir," Mrs. Washington replied. "They simply ordered me out of the car and began throwing things around." She kept her voice level, but her hands tightened slightly on her purse, the same purse they had roughly searched, spilling its contents across her car's hood. The colonel played another video, this one showing the officers tossing aside her Bible and church programs. "Chief, I'd like to point out that my mother's property was treated with complete disregard. These items include personal teaching materials she's kept for decades, religious items, and church donations she was responsible for protecting." The younger officer attempted to speak up. "Sir, we were following protocol for suspicious." "Protocol?" The colonel interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of his military authority. "Please point out which protocol authorizes the harassment of a 72-year-old retired teacher driving home from church. I'm very interested in reviewing that particular section of your handbook." The chief raised a hand, silencing any further attempts at justification. "Mrs. Washington, you've been a part of this community longer than most of us in this room. You taught at Franklin Elementary for 30 years, correct?" "Yes, sir, 3 decades of 4th grade." A small smile touched her lips. "In fact, I taught Officer Wilson's older sister. She was wonderful with multiplication tables." The older officer, Wilson, seemed to shrink in his chair, the realization of who he had harassed earlier that day finally sinking in. His sister had indeed been in Mrs. Washington's class, something he should have remembered when he saw the name on her license. The colonel continued his methodical presentation. "We have statements from 12 neighbors who witnessed the incident. They've all provided contact information and are willing to testify if necessary." He gestured to the stack of papers before him. "Additionally, the videos clearly show no probable cause for the stop or the subsequent search." Lieutenant Brooks spoke up, her voice carrying professional disappointment. "Chief, I've reviewed the patrol car's dash cam footage. There was no traffic violation recorded, and the officers failed to call in the stop according to procedure." The afternoon sun had faded into evening, casting long shadows through the conference room windows. Mrs. Washington thought about her Sunday dinner, still unprepared at home, but this was more important. She'd spent her life teaching children about accountability. Now she was seeing it in action. "Mrs. Washington," the chief said, closing his notebook, "I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. This is not how we train our officers to behave, and there will be consequences." He turned to the colonel. "I assume you'll be filing a formal complaint." "Yes, sir," the colonel replied, his military bearing unwavering. "However, my mother and I are more interested in systemic changes than individual punishments. We'd like to discuss implementing new training protocols, particularly regarding interaction with elderly citizens and long-term community members." Mrs. Washington smiled at her son's words. Even in this situation, he was thinking like the teacher's son he was, looking for ways to turn a negative experience into a learning opportunity. The chief nodded thoughtfully. I believe we can work with that. Lieutenant Brooks has already suggested using this incident as a training case study. He turned to Mrs. Washington. Would you be willing to participate in some of these training sessions? Share your perspective with our officers. Before she could respond, her son interjected professionally. We can discuss those details later, sir. Right now, my mother needs to rest. It's been a long day. His protective instinct was clear, but tempered by his military discipline. The chief stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Of course, Mrs. Washington will have an officer drive you and your car home. He paused, then added with a slight smile, not either of these officers, of course. As they gathered their belongings, Mrs. Washington caught sight of her reflection in the conference room window. She saw what everyone else in the room saw, not a victim, but a dignified woman who had turned an unjust situation into an opportunity for positive change. Her mother would have been proud. The colonel helped her with her coat, ever the dutiful son despite his high rank. As they walked out of the conference room, several officers in the hallway stood straighter, offering respectful nods. Word had spread through the department about what had happened and about how this elderly teacher and her military son had handled it with grace and professionalism. Yes, sir, the colonel replied, his military bearing unwavering. However, my mother and I are more interested in systemic changes than individual punishments. We'd like to discuss implementing new training protocols, particularly regarding interaction with elderly citizens and long-term community members. Mrs. Washington smiled at her son's words. Even in this situation, he was thinking like the teacher's son he was, looking for ways to turn a negative experience into a learning opportunity. The chief nodded thoughtfully. I believe we can work with that. Lieutenant Brooks has already suggested using this incident as a training case study. He turned to Mrs. Washington. Would you be willing to participate in some of these training sessions? Share your perspective with our officers. Before she could respond, her son interjected professionally. We can discuss those details later, sir. Right now, my mother needs to rest. It's been a long day. His protective instinct was clear, but tempered by his military discipline. The chief stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Of course, Mrs. Washington will have an officer drive you and your car home. He paused, then added with a slight smile, not either of these officers, of course. As they gathered their belongings, Mrs. Washington caught sight of her reflection in the conference room window. She saw what everyone else in the room saw, not a victim, but a dignified woman who had turned an unjust situation into an opportunity for positive change. Her mother would have been proud. The colonel helped her with her coat, ever the dutiful son despite his high rank. As they walked out of the conference room, several officers in the hallway stood straighter, offering respectful nods. Word had spread through the department about what had happened and about how this elderly teacher and her military son had handled it with grace and professionalism. 3 months after that fateful Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Washington stood at the podium in the police academy's main lecture hall. The room was filled with both veteran officers and new recruits, all watching attentively as this dignified former teacher prepared to share her story. Her son, the colonel, sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of how one person's actions could spark meaningful change. Good morning, she began, her teacher's voice carrying to every corner of the room. I'm here today not to condemn but to educate. Her words carried the weight of 40 years of classroom experience. What happened to me that Sunday afternoon could have ended very differently. Instead, it became a catalyst for change. The changes she spoke of were already visible throughout the department. New protocols had been implemented for traffic stops involving elderly citizens. Community engagement programs had been expanded, and a civilian review board had been established with Mrs. Washington as one of its founding members. The 2 officers who had stopped her that day had been reassigned to community service duties after their suspension. Now they spent their days working with local youth programs and elderly assistance services, a fitting consequence that focused on education rather than punishment. When those officers approached my car that day, Mrs. Washington continued, they saw what they expected to see. An elderly black woman who didn't belong in that neighborhood, driving a car they didn't think she could afford. She paused, letting her words sink in. What they failed to see was a teacher who had shaped generations of this community's children, including some of their own family members. In the audience, Officer Wilson, one of the officers from that day, shifted in his seat. His sister, now a school principal herself, had joined the Civilian Review Board alongside Mrs. Washington. Family dinners had become opportunities for difficult but necessary conversations about bias and respect. The colonel stood and joined his mother at the podium, his military bearing commanding attention. "The incident that brought us here today represents both a failure and an opportunity," he addressed the room. "A failure in how we approach community policing, but an opportunity to learn and grow from our mistakes." He clicked through a presentation showing statistics from the past 3 months, a significant decrease in complaints about officer conduct, increased community engagement, and positive feedback from local residents. The changes weren't just on paper, they were felt throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Washington smiled as she watched her former student, Tom Chen, now a practicing lawyer, enter the hall. He had been instrumental in drafting the new protocols, ensuring they protected both officers and citizens while promoting respectful interaction. His law firm had taken on several pro bono cases, helping other elderly residents who had faced similar situations. "Our community came together that day," Mrs. Washington continued, gesturing to the photos being displayed. Neighbors helping gather her scattered belongings, young people recording the incident, elderly residents sharing their own stories. "But more importantly, we've stayed together, working to ensure such incidents don't happen to others." The changes reached beyond their local department. Other precincts had begun adopting their training program, dubbed the Washington Protocol, in honor of both the retired teacher who inspired it and her son who helped implement it. Mrs. Washington's story had been featured in national law enforcement journals, becoming a case study in how to turn a negative incident into positive institutional change. In the back of the room, Lieutenant Brooks nodded approvingly. She had become one of the strongest advocates for the new changes, using her position to ensure the reforms weren't just temporary responses, but permanent improvements to how the department operated. "Every Sunday," Mrs. Washington said, her voice warm with memory, "I still drive home from church along the same route. But now, when I pass police officers, I see something different in their eyes: recognition, respect, understanding." She smiled at the room full of officers, and that's what community policing should be about, seeing each person as a member of our shared community. The colonel stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of both his military rank and his position as a son. "The changes we've implemented here aren't just about following new protocols. They're about changing mindsets, about recognizing that every traffic stop, every interaction, is an opportunity to either build or break community trust." Mrs. Washington's phone buzzed softly. A text from one of her former students, now serving as a police officer in another state, asking about implementing similar programs in their department. The ripples of change continued to spread, touching lives far beyond their small Georgia community. "I want to leave you with one final thought," Mrs. Washington concluded, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "That Sunday afternoon could have left me bitter, angry, afraid. Instead, it reminded me of something I've always taught my students, that every challenge is an opportunity to teach, to learn, and to grow." The room erupted in applause, but Mrs. Washington wasn't finished. She reached into her bag, the same one that had been roughly searched months ago, and pulled out a stack of papers. "Now," she said, her teacher's smile warming the room, "let's talk about how we can continue to build bridges between law enforcement and our community. Because this story isn't just about what happened that Sunday. It's about what happens next, and how we all work together to write the next chapter." As she looked out at the eager faces before her, Mrs. Washington saw not just officers, but members of her extended community. She saw former students, children of former students, and young people who reminded her of the countless children she'd taught over the years. Most importantly, she saw hope. Hope for real change, hope for better understanding, and hope for a future where dignity and respect would be the foundation of every interaction between police and the communities they served.